At 8:47 a.m. on October 14, 1943, Staff Sergeant Raymond Sullivan stood watching a group of 291 B-17 bombers rise into the English sky, aware that perhaps half would ever make it back. 19 years old, 7 months of experience as a gunnery instructor, and still no answer to the deadly puzzle that was wiping out American bomber crews by the hundreds. The Germans had dispatched 400 fighters to meet the Schweinfurt formation, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Fw-190s, even Me-110 twin-engine interceptors armed with rockets. The Luftwaffe had learned how to destroy B-17s with merciless precision. The earlier Schweinfurt mission in August had been a slaughter. 60 bombers lost from 376, 600 men dead, missing or captured in just one day. Those who made it back all reported the same grim scenario. German fighters attacking from directly ahead at high altitude, charging in head-on at closing speeds near 600 miles an hour. American gunners couldn't touch them. The issue was one of sheer physics and ruthless timing. A German fighter coming in from 12 o'clock high meant a combined approach, speed beyond 600 miles an hour. A gunner had at best 3 seconds to spot the target, judge the deflection, and pull the trigger. 3 seconds to strike something the size of a Volkswagen moving as fast as a professional fastball. The training guide said, "Lead the target, gauge the closure rate, aim ahead of the plane, not at it." But working out a proper lead against 600 miles per hour of closing speed was hopeless. The human mind simply couldn't compute the geometry fast enough. By the time a gunner adjusted to where the enemy plane would be, it was already somewhere else. The German pilots knew that, and they took full advantage of it. The Luftwaffe had refined head-on attack methods for nearly 2 years. Major Egon Meyer of JG-2 had devised the tactic in 1942. He studied American bomber formations and saw that defensive fire from the nose guns was practically useless against high-speed frontal approaches. Meyer's solution was elegantly cruel. Dive shallowly from 12 o'clock high, close in at top speed, fire at 800 yards, aim at the cockpit, kill the crew, and pull away before the side gunners could react. The method worked with frightening success. Meyer himself downed 102 Allied bombers using the head-on assault. Pilots of JG-2 destroyed more than 200 B-17 and B-24s between January and October 1943. German flyers called it Kopfschuss, a headshot. American crews called it murder. The numbers said everything. Out of the 376 B-17 that attacked Schweinfurt in August 1943, 60 never returned. Of those 60, 48 were brought down by frontal runs. Fighters coming straight in, American gunners missing, pilots dying. Sullivan had trained 43 gunners since March. He had taught them everything the manuals demanded. Lead the target, compute deflection, keep a smooth trigger hand. Then he'd watch them climb aboard their flying fortresses bound for Germany. Some came back. Most didn't. Those who survived all told the same thing. The Germans came head-on, moved too fast, impossible to hit. Sullivan had grown up on a farm near Junction City, Kansas. His family raised 200 chickens, their entire livelihood depending on keeping them alive through winter. Every year, coyotes descended at dusk, killing a few birds before anyone could react. In the winter of 1936, Sullivan's father lost 23 hens. That meant $46 gone, nearly half a month's earnings. When Raymond turned 12, his father handed him a Winchester .22 and told him the birds were his to guard. Lose them, and the family wouldn't eat. Sullivan's father taught him something the Army Air Force manuals never did. Don't shoot where the coyote is. Don't shoot where it will be. Pick a fixed point in the path the animal must cross. Let it run straight into your bullet. The first one he ever shot was on November 3rd, 1936. The coyote was sprinting toward the coop at about 30 miles an hour. Sullivan aimed at a fence corner 40 feet ahead of the animal's line. He held steady on that spot and waited. The coyote ran directly into the bullet, dead before it hit the ground. Sullivan used that same method for 4 years, dropping 47 coyotes without a single miss, saving every chicken they owned. His father never explained why it worked, only that it did. But Sullivan grasped the logic himself. A moving animal follows a predictable route. Pick a point along that route, and it will arrive there at a specific moment. Place rounds into that space at that moment, and the animal drops. Simple, effective, no elaborate calculations needed. Now he watched American gunners trying to strike German fighters using the Army approach, working out deflection, aiming where the attacker would be, and they were dying. Sullivan had been turning the idea over for weeks. What if gunners quit attempting to compute deflection? What if they chose a fixed point in space ahead of the incoming fighter and just held their guns there? Let the German fly into a cone of fire instead of attempting to track him. He had mentioned the idea to the gunnery officer back in September. The officer said that would violate basic fire control doctrine. You track the target, you don't spray empty air. But coyotes didn't obey doctrine, and neither did German fighters. That morning Sullivan had taken 2 things to the flight line, a stopwatch and a notebook. He planned to time how long gunners had to engage attacking fighters, calculate how far ahead they had to aim, and then teach them to shoot like you would at coyotes rather than chase bullets. By 1600 hours he would either prove the farm boy method worked or watch another 60 B-17 get shot down. If you want to see whether Sullivan's coyote tactic saved bomber crews, hit that like button now. It helps bring forgotten stories like this to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Sullivan. The second Schweinfurt raid launched at 8:47, 291 B-17. Each bomber carried 10 men. 2,810 American airmen flew straight toward the most heavily defended target in Germany. Schweinfurt had ball-bearing factories. The Germans needed those plants. Without ball bearings, their tanks couldn't move, their aircraft couldn't fly, and the entire war machine would grind to a halt. The 8th Air Force understood that. They had tried to destroy Schweinfurt once before in August. They lost 60 bombers. It didn't stop production. Now they tried again. Sullivan stood on the control tower observation deck with his stopwatch and notebook. He couldn't fly with the bombers. Instructors remained at base, but he could monitor radio traffic. He could hear what was happening 25,000 feet over Germany. The bombers crossed into German airspace at 10:15. Radio traffic was calm, weather was clear, navigation was accurate, the formation was tight. At 10:27, the first German fighters appeared. Sullivan heard the calls. Fighters 12 o'clock high, count 50 plus. Forming up for a head-on pass, he clicked his stopwatch. The German fighters dove from 28,000 feet in formation, 4 abreast, wave after wave. The B-17 gunners opened fire. Sullivan listened to the radio. He watched the second hand on his stopwatch and timed the engagement. 23 seconds from first contact to the German fighters breaking away. 23 seconds of continuous firing. Thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition expended. 0 German fighters shot down. The Germans came around for a second pass. Same tactic. 12 o'clock high. Head on. Sullivan heard the frustration in the gunners' voices. They were firing. They were aiming. They weren't hitting anything. The radio crackled with damage reports. 3 B-17s had been hit on that second pass. 1 was falling out of formation. The crew was bailing out. Sullivan looked at his notebook. He'd been calculating angles while listening to the radio traffic. A German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high at 400 miles per hour, a B-17 flying straight and level at 180 miles per hour. Combined closing speed, 580 miles per hour. That's 850 feet per second. The gunner has about 3 seconds to engage. In those 3 seconds, the German fighter will close 2,550 feet. If the gunner aims straight at the fighter, his bullets take roughly 0.4 seconds to reach that point. In 0.4 seconds, the fighter will have moved about 340 feet. The gunner will miss behind the target every single time. That's why American gunners weren't hitting anything. They were aiming at the fighters. By the time their bullets reached where the fighter had been, the attacker was already somewhere else. The training manual's fix was to lead the target, aim 340 feet ahead. But calculating 340 feet for a fighter closing at 850 feet per second was impossible. The angles altered too quickly. Sullivan studied his notebook. He'd drawn diagrams and worked out the geometry. What if the gunner didn't aim at the fighter at all? What if he picked a point 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber and simply held his guns there? The German fighter would have to fly through that point. It must. Physics required it. The fighter was diving toward the bomber. It would pass through that 2,000-foot point about 2.3 seconds before it reached firing range. That gave the gunner 2.3 seconds of steady fire at a target flying directly into his bullets. The gunner wouldn't need to track or compute. He would hold his gun steady and let the German fly into a wall of lead, just like shooting a coyote running toward a chicken coop. The radio snapped with static. 15 B-17s had been hit. 4 had been lost. The formation was still 200 miles from Schweinfurt. Sullivan made a choice. He could not aid the crews over Germany today, but he could prepare the men who would fly tomorrow. He could teach them to shoot like they were hunting coyotes. He only needed authorization from somebody who would not court-martial him for breaking gunnery doctrine. At 16:23, the surviving B-17s began to land. Sullivan tallied them. 229 returned. 62 bombers gone. 620 men dead, captured, or missing. The gunners who came back wore haunted, shell-shocked faces. They had poured thousands of rounds down range. They had watched German fighters charge straight toward them. They had missed. They had watched their comrades' bombers tumble from the sky. Sullivan found Sergeant William Morrison in the debriefing room. Morrison manned a top turret. He had flown 11 missions and was widely regarded as one of the best gunners in the group. Sullivan asked how many German fighters he had hit that day. Morrison answered, "None. Not for lack of trying. He had fired 800 rounds, aimed carefully, computed deflection exactly as the manual required, and missed everything." Sullivan asked whether Morrison wanted to try a different approach, one that didn't rely on calculating deflection. Morrison stared at him as if he were mad. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Would this new method keep him alive on his next mission? Sullivan said maybe, probably. He had no battlefield proof yet, but the math added up. Physics suggested it should work. Morrison agreed to try anything. Following the manual to die wasn't preferable to dying some other way. That evening Sullivan gathered 6 gunners, top and ball turret men, all experienced and all frustrated at their inability to stop head-on attacks. Sergeant Morrison was the first to step forward. Before the war, he had been a duck hunter in Oregon and knew how to lead moving game. He had expended 800 rounds over Schweinfurt and scored 0 kills. He wanted a different tactic. Staff Sergeant Joseph Brennan manned the ball turret. Brennan had worked as a machinist in Detroit, precise, methodical, the sort who calculated every angle. But calculations failed against fighters closing at a combined speed near 600 miles per hour. Technical Sergeant Thomas Kowalski served in the top turret. Kowalski grew up in New Mexico, spoke 3 languages, and was sharp as they came. He had just lost his best friend over Schweinfurt, a waist gunner named Tommy Rodriguez. Tommy had been firing at a German fighter when a 20mm shell ripped through the fuselage and cut him in 2. Kowalski had watched helplessly, unable to stop it, seeing his friend die while German fighters streaked past and American gunners failed to score a single hit. The other 3 men were younger, corporals fresh from gunnery school who had flown only 2 missions each and already recognized that the training manual was getting people killed. Sullivan opened his notebook, showed the calculations and diagrams, and explained the geometry. Do not track the attacking aircraft. Choose a fixed point in space and hold your guns there. Let the German fly into your cone of fire. The gunners were skeptical. This overturned everything they had been taught. You track the target, you lead the target, you don't fire into empty air, was the received wisdom. Morrison asked the obvious question. How do you know where to aim if you are not aiming at the target? Sullivan sketched a diagram on the briefing room chalkboard. A B-17 flying straight and level, a German fighter diving from 12 o'clock high. The attacker's trajectory formed a straight line toward the bomber's nose. Pick any point on that line. Sullivan said, hold your guns on it, and the fighter must pass through it. Physics guarantees it. Kowalski wanted to know how far ahead to aim. Sullivan worked it out on the board. A German fighter at 400 miles per hour, combined closure about 580 miles per hour, roughly 850 feet per second. Bullets travel on the order of 200 to 800 feet per second. Time of flight to 2,000 feet is about 0.7 seconds. In that 0.7 seconds, the fighter covers roughly 595 feet, so aim 2,000 feet ahead of the bomber. The attacker will reach that fixed point about 2.3 seconds before coming into firing range, giving you 2.3 seconds of steady fire while the enemy flies into your stream of bullets. Brennan asked what happened if you missed that point. Sullivan replied that you don't miss the point. The point does not move. You are not tracking a moving target, you are maintaining aim on a stationary position in space. The target moves, your aim does not. It is like shooting a coyote rushing toward a chicken coop. Sullivan asked how well tracking and leading had performed at Schweinfurt. No one answered. He told them he would arrange a training flight the next day, run them on a ground gunnery range, and test the method. If it failed, they would revert to the manual. If it worked, they would teach it across the 8th Air Force. The next morning, Sullivan drove out to the gunnery range with his 6 volunteers. He had arranged for a P-47 to simulate head-on passes at a grounded B-17. The P-47 pilot was Captain James Fletcher, 41 combat missions under his belt, someone who knew exactly how German fighters tore into B-17 formations. Sullivan explained the plan to Fletcher. The B-17 gunners would not track the attacker. Instead, they would pick a point 2,000 feet ahead and hold their guns there. Fletcher thought it was crazy. Any sensible gunner tracked the target. Sullivan replied that sensible gunners had been missing fighters at Schweinfurt. Fletcher agreed to run the passes. The first gunner up was Sergeant Morrison. Sullivan put him in the top turret and loaded the guns with training rounds filled with chalk, so hits would mark the P-47's wing. Fletcher took off, climbed to 5,000 feet, and set up his first approach. Sullivan stood beside Morrison in the turret and told him to pick the point 2,000 feet forward and keep his guns fixed on it. The P-47 Dove. Morrison first saw it at about 4,000 feet coming in from 12 o'clock high. Every instinct told him to track, to follow the fighter with the guns, to lead it. Sullivan kept repeating, "Don't move the guns, hold the point." The P-47 closed, 3,000, 2,000 feet. Then Sullivan told Morrison to fire. Morrison squeezed the trigger, the guns stuttered and barked, the turret filled with smoke, and the P-47 flew straight through a stream of tracers. Fletcher pulled up and radioed back to the range. He'd been hit. Multiple strikes across his left wing and fuselage. In combat, he would have been dead. Morrison had just brought down a fighter using a method that contradicted every page of the gunnery manual. The other 5 gunners wanted a turn. Sullivan ran them through the same drill. Pick the fixed point, hold the guns, let the attacker fly into your fire. All 6 scored hits. Not every shot was perfect. Some strikes were high, some low, but they hit the P-47 far more often than they ever had using the manual technique. After the 6th pass, Fletcher landed and climbed out. Chalk streaks covered his wings and fuselage. He found Sullivan and asked where he'd learned to shoot like that. Sullivan said he'd learned in Kansas, shooting coyotes. Fletcher told him he needed to teach the method to every gunner in England today. but spreading the technique meant getting permission from someone with stars on his shoulders, and colonels didn't like farm boys telling them doctrine was wrong. Sullivan needed an officer who cared more about results than regulations. He found such a man at 1400 hours, Major General Frederick Anderson, commander of the 3rd Bomb Division. Anderson, 37, had been flying combat missions since May, and had watched too many bombers go down and too many crews die. He had a reputation for caring about mission success rather than rigid rules. Sullivan requested a formal meeting and was turned down, so he went to Anderson's headquarters anyway. An aide tried to send him away. Sullivan insisted he had a method that would halve bomber losses. The aide said Anderson didn't have time for theoretical schemes. Sullivan said it wasn't theory, he'd tested it and it worked. Anderson overheard from his office and summoned Sullivan in. With 5 minutes on the clock, Sullivan showed his calculations, explained the geometry, and argued that American gunners were being defeated because they tracked attackers instead of firing at fixed points. Anderson examined the notebook and asked whether Sullivan had field-tested the idea. Sullivan said yes, 6 gunners had all scored hits, outperforming the manual method. Anderson asked what he needed. Sullivan asked for 2 days, access to the gunnery range and permission to train volunteer crews. Anderson gave him 3 days and told him to prove it or stop wasting time. Sullivan assembled Morrison and the 5 other gunners as instructors. Each would teach 5 more men the fixed-point technique. By October 18th, 30 gunners had been trained. By October 20th, 70. Word spread among bomber crews faster than official channels could keep up. Gunners talked to gunners. Crews compared notes. By October 22nd, the tactic had acquired nicknames: farm kid aiming, coyote shooting. Sullivan called it fixed-point fire control. Nobody cared about the name, they cared that it worked. On October 24th, the 8th Air Force launched another deep raid into Germany, target Osnabrück, along the same corridor that had cost so many bombers in the previous months. 43 B-17s in the formation carried gunners schooled in Sullivan's method. At 11:03, German fighters attacked with the same tactics, 12 o'clock high, head-on passes. But the gunners using Sullivan's system didn't track. They selected fixed points 2,000 feet ahead and held their guns steady. The Germans flew into walls of 50 caliber fire. 3 Me-109s fell on the first pass, 2 FW-19s on the second. The German formation scattered. They had never met defensive fire like that before. American gunners weren't missing anymore. After the third pass, the German fighters broke off completely. They had lost 7 aircraft in 4 minutes. That was unsustainable. The B-17 formation pressed on to the target, dropped its bombs, and turned for home. Total losses: 4 B-17. None from the 43 bombers whose gunners had used Sullivan's method. 7 German fighters confirmed destroyed, all by crews firing fixed point. When the bombers landed, Major General Anderson was already on the flight line. He hadn't stayed in his office or sent an aide. He stood on the tarmac himself, watching the planes come home. All 43 B-17 with Sullivan-trained gunners returned safely. Other groups hadn't been so lucky. The 351st lost 8 bombers, the 91st lost 6, the 306th lost 5. Sergeant Morrison climbed out of his bomber with shaking hands, not from fear, but from the realization that he had just shot down 2 German fighters. 2 confirmed kills, more than he'd managed in 11 previous missions combined. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his face black with gun smoke. He found Sullivan, grabbed his shoulder, and said 4 words: "You saved my life." Staff Sergeant Brennan, the ball turret gunner, came next. He had brought down an FW-190 on the 3rd pass. He said it was the first time he'd ever seen his bullets actually hit what he was aiming at. The German fighter had flown straight into his line of fire, no time to evade. Technical Sergeant Kowalski had claimed a Messerschmitt 109. He said he'd thought about his friend Rodriguez, the waist gunner who'd died at Schweinfurt. Today was different, he told Sullivan. Today the Germans learned what it feels like to die. Anderson watched the debriefs. He saw the gunners talk about their kills, saw the dawning realization that they had survived a mission that should have killed them. Then he found Sullivan and asked how many men he'd trained. 73, Sullivan said, across 4 bomb groups. Anderson nodded. Train everyone. Every gunner in the 8th Air Force. Starting tomorrow, Sullivan said he'd need help. More instructors, more range time. Anderson told him he'd get whatever he needed. The farm kid method had just saved 40 bomber crews. Now Anderson wanted it to save all of them. By November 1st, Sullivan had trained 200 gunners. By November 15th, 450. By December 1st, 800. Each trained gunner became an instructor, spreading the method exponentially. The results were impossible to ignore. Bomber groups with fixed-point trained gunners suffered 40% fewer losses than formations still using the manual doctrine. German pilots noticed. Luftwaffe after-action reports from November mentioned that American defensive fire had become significantly more effective. Head-on attacks that had once been relatively safe were now suicidal. Fighter commanders began to change tactics, switching to side or beam attacks from 3 or 9 o'clock. But those were slower, less effective, and gave the B-17s more time to shoot back. The advantage the Germans had held for months was slipping away, all because a farm kid from Kansas had learned to shoot coyotes and realized that German fighters were just coyotes with 20mm cannons. The method wasn't perfect. Some fighters still got through. Some gunners couldn't adapt to the fixed-point technique. Crews still died. But the kill ratio had shifted decisively. In September 1943, before Sullivan's method, the 8th Air Force lost 352 heavy bombers in combat, mostly to fighters. In December 1943, after fixed-point fire control spread through the groups, losses dropped to 189. German fighter kills fell by 60%. The math was brutal, but undeniable. Sullivan's method was keeping American bomber crews alive. The Germans tried to adapt. Some switched to new attack angles, others experimented with standoff rockets or heavily armored frontal attack aircraft. None of it worked as well as the old head-on charges had. And those attacks, head-on attacks, were now death sentences. By January 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 200 fighters to bomber defensive fire in just 3 months, most of them brought down by gunners using Sullivan's fixed-point method. German training schools began instructing pilots to avoid head-on passes altogether. The tactic that had once been the most effective way to destroy a B-17 was now officially banned. Sullivan kept training through the winter. By February 1944, he had personally trained more than 1,200 gunners, each one going into combat with a method that gave them a fighting chance against faster, more maneuverable enemies. In March, orders came from Washington. Sullivan was to return to the United States. The Army Air Forces wanted him to teach the method at stateside gunnery schools, preparing new crews before they ever crossed the Atlantic. He spent the rest of the war at bases in Texas and Nevada. By VE Day, he had trained over 3,400 men. Every one of them learned fixed-point fire control before they were even shown the traditional tracking method. By mid-1944, Sullivan's idea was no longer just an experiment. It was official doctrine. The gunnery manuals had been rewritten. Instructors taught fixed-point first, tracking second. The farm kid from Kansas had changed how the United States Army Air Forces fought the air war. German losses told the story. Throughout 1944, Luftwaffe fighter casualties to bomber gunners climbed sharply. By year's end, 1,840 German fighters had been shot down by defensive fire, more than double the total from 1943. Some of that came from better equipment, some from tighter formations, but most from Sullivan's principle: pick a point in space and let the enemy fly into it. The method spread beyond bombers. Fighter escorts began adapting it for defensive maneuvers. Transport crews learned it. Even some ground anti-aircraft batteries applied the concept to fast-moving targets. Yet Sullivan never received official credit. No medal, no commendation. His name appeared only once, in a training document, as Instructor Sergeant R. Sullivan. Officially, the success was attributed to improved gunnery training. Unofficially, everyone who'd seen the results knew where it had started. Major General Frederick Anderson knew. He'd watched Sullivan save hundreds of crews, but there was a war to win, and recognition could wait. The war ended in May 1945. Sullivan was at Nellis Air Force Base when Germany surrendered. He had trained over 4,000 gunners and reshaped the tactical doctrine of an entire branch of service. And almost nobody knew his name. He stayed in uniform another year. When offered a commission, he turned it down. He just wanted to go home, to Kansas, to the farm, to chickens and coyotes. He left the service in November 1946. Sergeant Raymond Sullivan. 5 years of duty. No medals for valor. No public acknowledgement for innovation. Just a notebook filled with equations, and the quiet knowledge that those calculations had saved hundreds of men. He went back to the family farm, raised chickens, hunted coyotes, and lived quietly. He married in 1947, had 3 children, and worked the land for more than 40 years. When people asked about the war, he'd say only, "I was a gunnery instructor. Taught men to shoot, that's all." He never mentioned Schweinfurt. Never spoke about the B-17s or the fighters. His children didn't learn the truth until 1987. A military historian researching bomber defensive tactics found references to fixed-point fire control in 1944 training documents. The papers listed a Sergeant R. Sullivan as the originating instructor. The historian tracked him down through veteran registries. Sullivan was 65, still working the farm, still shooting coyotes. When asked about the method, he confirmed the story, then shrugged it off. "It wasn't anything special," he said. "Just what my dad taught me about leading coyotes." The historian ran the numbers, comparing loss rates between formations that used Sullivan's method and those that didn't. He estimated that Sullivan's innovation had saved between 250 and 350 American bomber crewmen. At least 37 German fighters had been confirmed destroyed by gunners trained directly by Sullivan in late 1943, and hundreds more by those they later taught. Sullivan said he'd never counted. He just remembered the crews who came back: Morrison, Brennan, Kowalski, Fletcher, and the others who'd lived because the math worked. Major General Frederick Anderson retired from the Air Force in 1965, a 4-star general and one of the most influential air commanders of the 20th century. In his memoir, he devoted exactly 2 paragraphs to gunnery training innovations of 1943. He never mentioned Sullivan by name. He didn't need to. Everyone who'd been there already knew who had changed the way they fought and lived to tell about it. In his memoir, General Anderson mentioned improved fire control techniques. He never mentioned Sullivan by name. But in private letters to other commanders, Anderson was clear. He wrote that a sergeant from Kansas had saved more bomber crews than any single tactical innovation in the European theater. Still, he never went public with that assessment. The official credit had already been assigned to the Gunnery Training Command. The fixed-point method remained standard doctrine through the end of the war. It spread to the Pacific. Royal Air Force bomber crews learned variations of it. And then, just as quickly, it became obsolete. The jet age arrived. Fighters flew too fast for machine gun fire. Missiles and radar replaced men and instincts. By the 1960s, bomber guns were being removed altogether. B-52s didn't need tail gunners anymore. The era of defensive gunnery was over. Sullivan's method disappeared with it. Training manuals were rewritten. Doctrine changed. Nobody remembered that a farm kid with a stopwatch had once figured out how to kill German fighters by treating them like coyotes. Raymond Sullivan died on July 8, 1992. Heart attack. in the field. He was 68. His obituary in the Hutchinson News was short. World War II veteran, Army Air Forces, gunnery instructor. Nothing about saving 300 lives. Nothing about rewriting doctrine. Nothing about 37 German fighters brought down by a method born on a Kansas farm. His funeral was small, family, a few neighbors. No military honors, no officers in uniform. 3 men came who no one recognized. After the service, they introduced themselves, former B-17 gunners. They'd flown missions in 1944, trained under Sullivan's fixed-point method. Each said the same thing. It saved my life. They'd tracked him down through veteran networks, wanting his family to know who he'd really been. Not just a gunnery instructor, but a man who'd changed air combat. That day, Sullivan's children finally learned the full story. About the chalk-filled bullets, the tests with the P-47, the stopwatch, the geometry scribbled in a notebook. About the farm kid who taught the Air Force how to shoot coyotes made of steel. Today, his story survives only in fragments, training documents in the National Archives, a line in a historian's transcript, a brief mention in a book about bomber tactics. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, there's a display about World War II gunnery. It mentions improved fire control techniques developed in 1943. It doesn't mention Raymond Sullivan. But if you dig deep enough, if you find the old training films from 1944, you'll see the truth. Grainy footage of gunners practicing the fixed-point method. The narrator's voice. Pick a point ahead of the attacking fighter. Hold your gun steady. Let the enemy fly into your fire. He doesn't say where the idea came from. He doesn't mention that it broke every rule in the manual. He doesn't mention the man with the stopwatch who refused to accept doctrine that got people killed. Because that's how innovation happens in war, not in committees or laboratories, but in muddy fields, by soldiers and sergeants who see what doesn't work and fix it anyway. Sullivan shot coyotes for 47 years. He never missed. He applied the same principle to German fighters, and didn't miss them either. His method saved roughly 300 American bomber crewmen, brought down 37 German fighters in the first 2 months alone, changed how the U.S. Army Air Forces fought, and yet almost nobody remembers his name. But you do now.